We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Did you think Ghostbusters was just a fun ghost hunting comedy with proton packs, Slimer, and a giant marshmallow man? Not quite. Behind that 1984 classic was a production even stranger than the ghosts on screen. Bill Murray practically turned Peter Venkman into his own character with improvised lines no one saw coming. One marshmallow scene that looked like pure comedy actually used 50 gallons of shaving cream and nearly turned into a real accident. Winston was once meant to have a much bigger role before the studio brutally cut him down. And even the legendary theme song couldn't escape a messy lawsuit. So how many bizarre secrets have Ghostbusters fans missed for all these decades? Stay tuned to find out. Number 1. Bill Murray turned Peter Venkman into an improv machine. If there was one person who made Ghostbusters more than just a ghost hunting comedy and turned it into a cultural phenomenon, it had to be Bill Murray. What made it so unusual was that he didn't simply step into the role of Peter Venkman and read the lines as written. He practically took over the character, bending every line, every beat, and every reaction until Venkman became a very strange kind of hero. Lazy, arrogant, charming, irresponsible, and yet so funny you couldn't look away. At first, Peter Venkman was written as a sarcastic scientist, a smooth talker with a sharp tongue and questionable ethics. But once Bill Murray showed up, the character instantly became something much harder to control. The script could set up the scene, and the director could shape the rhythm, but Murray always found a way to drop in an unexpected line, a sideways expression, or a reaction nobody on set saw coming. And that unpredictability is exactly what made Venkman feel alive. One of the most famous lines in the movie,
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Was not delivered like some stiff line memorized from a page. Murray tried different versions of it, pushing the energy higher each time until the line became a cocky little victory cry that felt perfectly Ghostbusters. His reaction to Slimer worked the same way. The line, "He's an ugly little spud, isn't he?" was improvised in the moment, but it sounded so natural that it felt like it had always belonged there. What makes it even funnier is that you can sometimes feel the other actors trying to keep a straight face around him. Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis often looked like they were surviving their own scene partner, because one wrong beat could have broken the entire scene into laughter. But instead of ruining the movie, that chaos became part of its soul. The truth is, without Bill Murray, Ghostbusters still might have been an interesting idea. But because of him, Peter Venkman became the character audiences never forgot. Not because he was perfect, but because he felt like a man who refused to follow the rules, even when the world was falling apart. And sometimes, the actor who refuses to obey the script is the one who saves the whole movie. Number 2. The marshmallow explosion was actually 50 gallons of shaving cream. The scene where the giant marshmallow man explodes in Ghostbusters looks funny, bizarre, and perfectly in line with the movie's completely unserious ending. A huge, white marshmallow monster, somehow both terrifying and ridiculous, finally gets destroyed and rains down a flood of white goo all over New York. Watching it, you might think it was just a silly visual gag. But behind the scenes, the truth was a lot more dangerous. What fell on the actors in that scene was not real marshmallow, it was shaving cream. And not just a little bit for effect. Around 50 gallons of shaving cream were prepared to cover the entire set in white foam. The idea sounded simple enough. Make the audience feel like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man had melted and exploded into a giant mess of white sludge. But on a film set, what looks soft on screen is not always gentle in real life. William Atherton, who played Walter Peck, was the one who had to take the full hit from the marshmallow drop. The original plan was for him to stand there while the load of shaving cream came crashing down on him. But Atherton was smart enough to ask one very reasonable question. Could they test it on a stuntman first? And that question may have saved him from a real accident. When the crew tested the drop on a stunt performer, it did not fall gently the way they expected. Instead of floating down like foam, the mixture came down with serious force and nearly knocked the stuntman flat. That was when everyone realized this goofy-looking scene could actually be dangerous if they shot it as planned. After that, the crew had to thin out the mixture, reduce the weight, and adjust the setup so Atherton could film the scene more safely. The irony is that the final scene still feels hilarious, like nothing more than a ridiculous gag to end the battle with the Marshmallow Man. But behind that laugh was a very Hollywood lesson. Sometimes the most harmless-looking thing on screen is exactly what actors have to worry about most in real life. And in the case of Ghostbusters, a fake marshmallow shower came dangerously close to becoming a real on-set accident. Number 3. In Ghostbusters, Winston Zeddemore shows up fairly late in the story, like an ordinary man just looking for a job who accidentally walks into an office full of strange ghost hunters. He does not talk like an eccentric scientist, and he does not act like someone who is already used to the supernatural. That is exactly what makes Winston so relatable. He feels like the audience inside the story, looking at everything with a more grounded, clear-headed, and sometimes confused point of view. But the truth is, Winston was never meant to be that small of a character. In the script Ernie Hudson read when he auditioned, Winston had much more screen time and importance. He was originally written as a former Air Force major with military experience, tactical knowledge, and expertise in explosives. In other words, he was not just the new guy hired to fill a spot on the team. He was supposed to be a strong member with a clear backstory, someone who brought a very different energy to the Ghostbusters. The problem was, everything changed right before filming began. Ernie Hudson received a new version of the script, and Winston's role had been dramatically reduced. The character entered the story much later, his backstory was removed, and many of his important moments disappeared. From someone who could have stood shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the team, Winston was pushed into a more secondary role, appearing only after the main trio had already taken over the center of the story. The reason behind it was that the studio wanted to put more focus on Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, and Harold Ramis. They were bigger names, more familiar faces, and were seen as safer box office draws. But for Ernie Hudson, he had entered the project believing he was playing a layered character, only to realize right before filming that the role he was given was no longer the same as the one he had signed on for. What makes it impressive is that Winston still never disappeared from the audience's memory. Even after so much of the role was cut down, Ernie Hudson gave the character a calm, grounded presence all his own. Among three eccentric scientists, Winston made everything feel a little less strange. He did not need a lot of dialogue to matter. By showing up at the right moments and reacting the way a normal person actually would, Winston became an essential part of Ghostbusters. Number 4. Some songs only need a few notes before the audience instantly remembers an entire movie. For Ghostbusters, that song begins with one unforgettable line: "Who you gonna call?" It was simple, fun, easy to remember, and practically made for an entire theater to sing along. It helped the movie move beyond the screen, making its way onto radio, television, commercials, Halloween playlists, and eventually into pop culture itself. But behind that seemingly carefree theme song was a story that was anything but simple. Ray Parker Jr. was given the job of writing the theme song on a very tight deadline. He had to create a track that was catchy, matched the movie's strange sense of humor, and was strong enough to stand on its own as a hit. And he pulled it off. The song quickly climbed to number 1, played everywhere, and even earned an Oscar nomination. But the bigger it got, the more people started asking, didn't that groove sound a little familiar? Earlier, during the editing process, the crew had used "I Want a New Drug" by Huey Lewis and the News as a temporary track. They had also wanted Huey Lewis to write the official theme for the movie, but he turned it down because he was busy with another project. After Ghostbusters exploded, Huey Lewis claimed Ray Parker Jr.'s song sounded too much like his own. That was where the lawsuit began. Everything was eventually settled out of court, along with a confidentiality agreement. But the story did not end there. Years later, Huey Lewis mentioned the settlement on television, and Ray Parker Jr. sued him in return, claiming that it violated their agreement. So a song made to make audiences laugh, dance, and sing along ended up dragging along a long-running legal battle. And strangely enough, that drama only made the Ghostbusters theme song even harder to forget. Number 5. Some characters become memorable, not because the script wrote them perfectly, but because the actors stepped in and made them feel far more alive than they were on the page. In Ghostbusters, that happened with both Rick Moranis and Sigourney Weaver. They did not just perform what they were given, they helped reshape the way audiences would remember their characters. At first, Louis Tully was just a nerdy, awkward, slightly strange neighbor. He had a clear purpose in the story, but he was not necessarily the kind of supporting character audiences would never forget. Rick Moranis saw another way in. He turned Louis into a small, nervous accountant who was always trying to be friendly, but talked as if taxes, bills, and party expenses were the best way to connect with other human beings. Those tiny details made Louis funnier, more believable, and much harder to forget. Louis' party scene is the clearest example. Moranis improvised much of the dialogue, including the part where Louis talks about the price of the salmon, the cost after tax, and why he invited clients instead of friends. It sounds ridiculous, but that offbeat way of talking is exactly what made Louis one of the movie's most charming supporting characters. With Sigourney Weaver, the story gets even stranger. When she auditioned for Dana Barrett, she did not just read lines for the director. She wanted to show what it might feel like when Dana was possessed by Zool. And instead of playing it in a typical spooky way, Weaver chose to perform it like a possessed animal, climbing onto the table, growling, howling, and committing so fully that Ivan Reitman immediately understood she was the right choice. Number 6. What made Ghostbusters special was how grounded it felt. This was not a story about larger-than-life superheroes. It was about 3 guys starting a ghost hunting business in New York, dealing with office rent, difficult customers, and ghost traps that may or may not have been safe to use. But the strange thing is, the first version of the movie was not grounded at all. In fact, Ghostbusters almost became a massive sci-fi adventure. In Dan Aykroyd's original idea, the movie was called Ghost Smashers. The story did not just take place in New York, and it was not simply about a group of guys launching a paranormal business. It was set in the future, where teams of ghost hunters traveled across different planets, dimensions, and timelines to fight supernatural forces. In simple terms, this was no longer a compact ghost hunting comedy. It was almost a space epic mixed with horror and action. Even the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, the image audiences remember as the movie's final showdown, was originally just one of many giant monsters in the script. That alone shows how huge the original concept was. But the problem was that a movie like that in the early 1980s was almost impossible from a budget standpoint. If they had kept it that way, it could have required an enormous amount of money, the kind of money a studio would have struggled to approve for a weird comedy about ghosts. That is why Ivan Reitman brought the story back down to earth. Instead of hunting ghosts across the universe, the characters became men running a ghost-catching service right in the middle of New York. And that turned out to be the decision that saved the movie. Because once Ghostbusters became smaller, it became funnier, more relatable, and far more memorable. Sometimes an idea does not need to get bigger to get better. It just needs to be placed somewhere the audience can believe in and laugh along with. Number 7. On screen, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is one of the most unforgettable images in Ghostbusters. He is ridiculous, enormous, and so funny that audiences can almost forget he is supposed to be the movie's final monster. That contrast is exactly what made Stay Puft iconic. But behind that soft, white, goofy-looking exterior was a behind-the-scenes story that was anything but comfortable. The Stay Puft suit was actually extremely bulky, hot, and uncomfortable. It was so large that one person could not wear it through every scene. The crew had to rotate multiple performers in and out of the costume, depending on the type of movement needed. One performer handled the regular walking scenes, while others took care of the falling, burning, or exploding moments. Just moving around inside that suit was a nightmare because visibility was very limited, the temperature inside was high, and the performer was basically trapped inside a heavy costume. The funny thing is, the cuter the character looked on screen, the harder it was behind the scenes. Stay Puft may be a movie icon, but for the people who had to step inside that suit, he was basically a marshmallow nightmare. Number 8. The library ghost scene at the beginning of Ghostbusters works almost like the movie's first greeting. A little spooky, but still playful enough to tell the audience they are not watching a straight horror film. But what many people do not know is that the original version of that scene was much scarier. The first design for the ghost leaned darker, uglier, and much closer to real horror than a supernatural comedy. When the scene was shown to test audiences, the reaction was not excitement or laughter. People were almost pushed back by it because it felt too frightening for the tone of the movie. The problem was that Ghostbusters needed the audience to believe the ghosts were real, but it still had to stay funny and easy to enjoy. If the opening felt too intense, viewers could have misunderstood the whole movie. So the filmmakers had to redo the transformation scene, soften the horror, and turn it into a shorter jump scare. The final result still startled audiences, but it did not break the movie's signature comedic tone. Number 9. On screen, the proton pack is one of the coolest symbols of Ghostbusters. The moment you hear it power up and see that energy stream fire, you immediately feel like the team is ready to handle anything. But for the cast, those packs were nowhere near as cool as they looked. The hero proton packs used for close-up shots were packed with details, lights, and components, which made them extremely heavy. Some weighed around 30 to 35 pounds, and a few crew members even claimed the fully rigged versions may have been close to 50 pounds. The actors had to wear them for hours while running, standing, and performing as if everything was perfectly normal. So the more exciting each ghost hunting scene looked on screen, the more physically exhausting it was behind the scenes. The proton pack may have thrilled audiences, but for the actors, it was basically a burden strapped to their backs. Number 10. It may sound hard to believe, but some of the street scenes in Ghostbusters were not filmed like a big studio production with the entire area fully controlled. Instead, the crew often had to work almost like guerrilla filmmakers. Bring in the camera, grab the real energy of New York, and move on to the next location before things got out of hand. That risky approach is part of what made the movie feel so alive. The crowded streets, curious passers-by, noise, and people staring at the crew were not always perfectly staged. Some scenes were shot quickly at famous locations, making New York feel less polished and more chaotic, exactly like the city itself. And sometimes, that chaos pulled Bill Murray right into the middle of it. When crowds gathered around, he had to joke with them on the spot to keep the mood under control. That is why Ghostbusters did not just film in New York. It almost stole the real heartbeat of the city. Number 11. For Hollywood. In the early 1980s, Ghostbusters was a very strange gamble. This was not a small comedy that could be shot simply and rely only on jokes. It needed visual effects, complicated props, big locations, giant monsters, and a tone that was not easy to sell. Part comedy, part supernatural adventure, and part horror. So when Columbia agreed to spend around $25 to $30 million on the project, it was an extremely bold move. That was a huge amount of money for a comedy at the time, especially when no one could be sure audiences actually wanted to watch a group of men start a ghost-catching business. But that risk made all the difference. With a smaller budget, Ghostbusters might have remained just a fun idea. Because Columbia was willing to bet big, the movie had enough scale to turn a ghost-hunting joke into a cinematic icon. Number 12. The important thing is that Ghostbusters could have been a very different movie if Ivan Reitman had not pulled it in a more grounded direction. Dan Aykroyd's original idea was too huge, too expensive, and almost impossible to make with the technology and budget of the early 1980s. Reitman saw the appeal of the ghost hunting concept, but he understood that the movie would work better if the audience felt like it could happen right outside their door. So instead of sending the characters through strange dimensions, he brought them back to New York and turned them into guys running a bizarre ghost-catching business. That decision made the movie much more relatable. The ghosts were still strange, but the world around them felt real. The office, the customers, the bills, and the noisy city. Number 13. One reason Ghostbusters sounds so bizarre but still feels strangely believable comes from Dan Aykroyd himself. He was not just writing about ghosts as a joke. Growing up, Aykroyd came from a family with a deep interest in the spiritual world, seances, and paranormal phenomena. So when he wrote Ghostbusters, he brought in a very specific kind of language, equipment, terminology, rituals, ancient entities, and rules that sounded like they actually existed. The funny thing is, details like Zool and Vinz Clortho did not come from real mythology. Aykroyd made them up, but he wrote them with so much confidence that audiences could easily believe they came from some ancient legend. That strange belief is what helped Ghostbusters become more than just funny. It gave the movie a world that felt oddly convincing. If you grew up with Ghostbusters 2, hit like, subscribe, and join us as we keep uncovering the weird secrets behind the movies that became legends.